My name is Hans Fischer. I'm 95 years old, and I'm a survivor, or as I often say, really an escapee of the Holocaust. Well, what life was like in my earliest youth is kind of difficult to describe because Hitler came into power in 1933 when I was only 5 years old, and I don't have any recollection of that period at all. I think the earliest recollection that I have is probably 1936, 37, because by that time things were getting very rough, although I personally did not experience them. When I say getting very rough, Jews lost their jobs. They couldn't work in many fields, and so life was difficult for my parents and older people, but I really didn't participate in those activities in which they were having their difficulties with the Nazi regime. I remember in 1937 traveling to Czechoslovakia for my maternal grandfather's 80th birthday. Why did we travel to Czechoslovakia? Because he had two daughters who were living in Israel. Of course, at that time it was Palestine only, and they couldn't come back into Germany. That would have been very dangerous. And so the birthday party was settled for Czechoslovakia. And as you can figure out, I was only 9 years old, but I do remember that period in Czechoslovakia. And we were there for my grandfather's birthday and for the high holidays, which were about the same time, September of that year, 1937. Well, I remember, of course, I went to school. I went to a Jewish day school, and I enjoyed school. I don't remember life at home as much as I remember life at the school. But I think that the period known as Kristallnacht really became such an important event in my life and in the life of my family that it has kind of blotted out so much of what happened before or what I experienced before. I do remember, again, I don't remember what year it was. I think it may have been in 1936. It may be the earliest that I remember, that my parents went to Palestine because they hoped to emigrate from Germany to Palestine. And so they left me in the care of a lady that they hired to kind of take care of me. And we lived in the home of friends of my family. And I remember that period, but only in a very broken way. You know, I remember a little bit from here and there, but not a continuous period. I can remember that there were periods when I couldn't get something that I wanted, and then I blamed this lady that was taking care of me. And I remember once exploding and breaking a window pane out of sheer nastiness on my part. But, you know, these are just broken pieces, not a continuum at all. Because, as I said a minute ago, the Kristallnacht really took over. Kristallnacht actually is named after November the 9th, the night of November 9th, when the Nazis went through the cities, the main thoroughfares, and broke the glass windows of Jewish-owned stores. I have no recollection of this at all. Didn't know anything had happened on the night of November 9th. Kristallnacht for me began in the morning of November 10th. I got up, as I always did, got dressed, and started to go to school. And when I went downstairs, we lived in a very large city on a main thoroughfare. And when I got downstairs from our apartment, I saw the broken glass, but I had no idea what that meant. I didn't know whether those particular stores had been Jewish stores or had not been Jewish stores. So I had no idea what that meant. Anyway, I walked towards school, and when I got close, it wasn't very far, I would say maybe a 15-minute walk. And when I got relatively close, there were barriers, wooden barriers that the police had put up, and there were lots of people standing there, including some other students who were in school with me, and we were told that we couldn't go any further. And within minutes after arriving there, a cry went up and said, "Look, look, the synagogue is burning." But I didn't see any synagogue burning, but I did see a lot of black smoke in the sky, and I assumed that that's what they were referring to. And it was not actually the synagogue that was very close to where I was. Actually, my school was right next door to a big synagogue, but it was not that synagogue that was burning, but a different synagogue in a different location that was burning, and that was destroyed that day. Anyway, when I saw that smoke and everybody was yelling, "Look, the synagogue is burning," I just turned around and ran back home and told my parents what I had experienced. And within, again, I would guess perhaps 10 minutes, 15 minutes, the doorbell rang, and two men in civilian clothes, well dressed, very polite, asked to see my father. And when my father came to the door, they told him that they had been authorized to come and ask him to accompany them, and that he should take a small bag with some underwear and some socks, and that they were taking him to the police station, and they didn't know what might be the events following getting to the police station. So he did that, and he left with them. And what happened to him was that once he got to the police station, he was taken to the train station and put on a train to a concentration camp. A few minutes after he had left and had gone to the police station, the doorbell rang again, and when I opened the doorbell, there were two SS men. SS was part of the Nazi, I'm trying to think, the SS stood for stormtroopers. And they were dressed in a black uniform and black boots, and they came in yelling and screaming, "You dirty Jews, where are you hiding your arms?" And they opened up drawers and went into bookshelves and just took everything that was in those drawers or on the bookshelves, and they threw it on the floor and continued to scream and yell and making anti-Semitic remarks. And they did this for about 15, 20 minutes or so, and then went to the door and left, just pulled it shut and left. And my father was gone, of course, as you heard, and my mother and I had a sister. They were home with me, and of course they were very upset by all this. My mother called a friend of my father's and told him what had happened, and so he went into hiding so that they never picked him up. And I didn't go to school anymore after this event. And the next thing that I actually remember is that my father was released. This, remember, was November 10th. he was released on January 6 from the concentration camp because he had been an officer in the German army in World War I. And this friend that my mother had called, my father's friend, was a lawyer, and he went to the Gestapo, which is the FBI of Germany during the Nazi era, and he showed them the papers that my father had been an officer in the army, and on that basis they released him from the concentration camp. By the way, the concentration camp was called Buchenwald, Buchenwald. Buchenwald is the name of an not a city, but of an area, actually quite far away from the city where we lived. Anyway, he came back with the proviso that he leave Germany within 2 weeks. He had to leave Germany within 2 weeks. And he actually got, again, I guess this friend of his got him a visa to go to Panama. And he took a boat from Hamburg to New York because there was no direct boat to Panama. And when he got to New York, he had some friends in New York, and they told him that he shouldn't go to Panama because the weather in Panama is god-awful, and that he'd be much better off if he went someplace else. And so he was able to get a visa to go to Cuba. And so he went from New York to Havana. And because he had gone to Havana, my mother, my sister, and I also wanted to meet up with him and become reunited in Cuba. And then, as bad luck had it, I came down with scarlet fever in, I don't remember anymore, must have been the end of January or beginning of February of 1939. And there were no antibiotics yet available. And so I was laid up for about 6 weeks in isolation, actually, so that others wouldn't catch it. And in early April, I was kind of back on my feet and recuperating. And then my mother got the necessary papers to go to Cuba and bought tickets on the boat called the St. Louis, which also left from Hamburg on May 13th, 1939. And so we left the city, which was Breslau, which is now called Wroclaw, W-R-O-C-L-A-W. It's now part of Poland. And we went by train to Hamburg from Breslau. And I remember right after arriving in Hamburg, my mother and I went to the Cuban consulate to pick up our landing permits. Not a visa, but it was called a landing permit. And my mother told me that she paid somewhere between $300 and $500 for each of us to the Cuban consulate. And I still remember after my mother picked those permits up, they were put into her passports, our passports, and she and I left the consulate, and as we were about to leave, right inside the consulate, right by the door from the consulate to the outside, there was a young lady sitting at a desk, and she turned to my mother and said, "Madam, would you like me to stamp a visa in your passports?" And my mother was kind of taken aback, and a few seconds, minutes later, she said, "Well, thank you very much, but I really don't think we need these visas because I just picked up these landing permits." And so she didn't get the visas, and we left. I should also add that this friend of my father's who had helped him get the original visas for Panama and who helped him get out of concentration camp, he had also accompanied us on the train to Hamburg. And when my mother and I went to the consulate, he stayed with my sister in the meantime. Anyway, the next day, which was a Friday, must have been Friday, May the 12th, he accompanied us to the boat, to the St. Louis, and we went on board the St. Louis. He did not, this friend of my father's did not. He went back down off. And the St. Louis left the next day, which was the 13th, Saturday, and left Hamburg the 13th. It made one stop outside a French port. I don't remember which one it was, and 20 other refugees, I believe most, if not all, came from Belgium, and they got on board. They just climbed up a rope ladder and got onto the St. Louis. I mention this because my best friend from school in Germany was among those, because he and his father had also been taken to concentration camp, and his mother, sister, and another brother had been able to leave Germany and go to Belgium. So they had been in Belgium, and they got onto the St. Louis outside a port in France. Anyway, we then went on the St. Louis to Havana, and in Havana we found out that we wouldn't be allowed to get off. And the reason we weren't allowed to get off had to do with skullduggery by the immigration officer, the Cuban immigration officer, who it turned out had kept all the money that the passengers had paid for landing permits, let's say $300 to $500 I mentioned my mother paid. There were almost 1,000 passengers on the St. Louis. So we're talking roughly $300,000 to $500,000, which this guy kept. And the president of Cuba didn't know about this and only discovered it when the St. Louis was already on its way from Hamburg to Havana. And the minute he found out about that, he contacted the immigration officer and asked for a cut. Whereupon the guy took the next boat from Havana to Miami, Florida, never to return, and of course never returned any of the money. Whereupon the president of Cuba, a man named Bru, B-R-U, said, "I will declare these permits invalid." That's why we were not allowed to get off. The St. Louis stayed, I think, for 2 weeks in the port of Havana without any of us being able to, I shouldn't say any, 20 people or so got off. Why did they get off? Because they had good connections. I can't remember the man's name right now, but there was a high-ranking American officer, and he had, through his connections, they were probably relatives or friends. These people were able to get off in Havana and take a helicopter to Florida, and so they were safe. But the rest of us were unlucky, and the St. Louis was kicked out of Havana. The captain, a very decent German person by the name of Schroeder, Gustav Schroeder, he went off the coast of Florida in the hope that Roosevelt would permit the passengers to get off in Florida. But that was not to be. Roosevelt did nothing of the kind. And the Prime Minister of Canada, a man by the name of Mackenzie King, was the same as Roosevelt. He was even worse. He said, "We are not going to let these Jews into Canada. They will pervert our pure Canadian blood." I found this in a history book that he made that comment. So in any case, then the next thing, the Coast Guard appeared and with bullhorns told the officers on the St. Louis to get the hell out of U.S. waters near Florida. And so willy-nilly, the St. Louis started on its way back to Europe. A Jewish organization called the Joint Distribution Committee had a representative in Belgium, and this man convinced the Belgian government to permit a quarter of the passengers from the St. Louis to get off and stay in Belgium. The St. Louis dropped anchor in Antwerp, Belgium, and everybody had to get off. And as I just mentioned, a quarter of the passengers were allowed to stay in Belgium, and the other 3/4 were divided up, another quarter into Holland, another third quarter into England, and last quarter into France. So England, France, Holland, Belgium. And my mother, my sister, and I were, just by chance, assigned to France. So we got onto another boat in Antwerp from the St. Louis, together with the passengers for England, and we first went to France, and the quarter for France got off. Again, I don't remember right now what harbor in France we got off on. My sister and my mother were put on a train and were sent to a small town in central France called Laval. And I, together with other children, all children that were 10 years old or older, were sent to a camp near Paris. And we were there. Now remember, this was in June. We had left in May, if you recall, May 13th. And by the time we left, it was towards the end of June. And World War II started on September 1, 1931. So we're talking about July and August. We were in France, and then the war broke out, and by that time my father in Cuba was able to get us visas, this time visas, V-I-S-A-S, to come to Cuba. The problem at this point was that the Nazis had a lot of submarines, in German U-boats. You probably have heard that term, U-boats. And they were sinking ships right and left, including American ships. Even though America wasn't in the war, but America had started a program called Land Lease. I don't know if you ever heard that term. Land Lease meant providing arms to England and to France and to Holland and Belgium and so on. And because of that, the Nazis felt justified in sinking American ships also. And so it was very hard to find a boat that was going anywhere from Europe. And so it was very difficult. And finally, in early December, we were able to get passage on a French boat. And the only reason why we were able to get passage on that French boat was because there was another group of immigrants, because the Spanish Civil War had just ended. The dictator who had won the power in Spain by the name of Franco, I don't know if you ever heard that name. He was a good friend of Hitler's. The people who fought against Franco, among whom were many Americans, of course, wanted to get out and go back to the United States. And so there were a lot of refugees. They were called Spanish refugees. And they came via the Pyrenees Mountains. The Pyrenees were on the border between Spain, Portugal, and France. They still are. And so these refugees escaped when the Spanish Civil War was over and Franco had won. These people escaped into France and then were able to get passage on this French boat. The name, I happen to just remember, the name of the French boat was D.E., and that's one word, and the second word was Grasse, G-R-A-S-S-E, de Grasse. Was an old boat that had already been put into mothballs, but they took it out because of these Spanish refugees. And my mother, my sister, and I, and some very few other Jewish refugees who were in France were able to get passage on that ship, de Grasse. And we first went to England from France, and a large number of other boats, British boats, joined this French boat in England. We were told there were a total of 200 boats, a convoy of 200 boats that left about a week after we got to England under the protection of 2 British warships to New York. So we were on this French boat, de Grasse, in the company of a whole bunch of British, mostly merchant ships, to New York, and we were very lucky. Not one of these boats was sunk by the Nazis. And we got to New York. In New York, we were put on Ellis Island. You know what Ellis Island is. And we had to go there because we didn't have papers to stay in the United States. So we had to wait there till there was a boat from New York to Havana. And we were there for a few days and then made it onto a tourist boat. There were lots of tourist boats, as there are now again, from New York to Havana, and then we were reunited with my father in Havana and were there just about a full year. And then we were lucky we were able to leave Havana, and we got permission to come to the United States, and we came to New York. And from New York, we got onto a farm in New Jersey, where I went to high school and so on. Yeah, that symbol, the swastika, always gave me pangs of fear, because that's certainly one thing that I remember from before all the events that I described to you. Whenever there was any kind of official German car or movement, you can take it for granted that there were swastikas, either in the form of flags or painted on. It was about as common as it could possibly be. So the swastika, as I said, was a symbol of fear for me. Well, I think it's taken on the symbolism of anti-Semitism. That's my guess. Because I can't offhand think of anybody else being either frightened or upset by this particular symbol, except Jews who were caught and put in concentration camps. It's my reading, and I have done a lot of reading, has always associated the swastika with Nazism in this country and elsewhere as well. So my guess is that the swastika has been a symbol of anti-Semitism more than anything else. I would ask him if he is aware of what that symbol meant. That would be my first question to him, because my guess is that a large percentage of students of that age probably don't know what it really stood for. And the term Nazi also may not mean all that much to them. So my first question would be if they know what it stands for, and assuming that they might be honest and tell me that they really don't quite know, it would give me the opportunity to get back to them and tell them that what it stood for and what a sad symbol it was and is, and that it is not something that they should look at with any kind of favor, but on the contrary, that this is something that should not appear anymore in their life, and hopefully they wouldn't be connected with it in any other way. Well, I think of the Nazis, I always think of Hitler as the standard bearer of this symbol.
Can I interrupt you for a second? Can I ask you to repeat that?
Yes.
And at the start of that statement, can you say, when I see the swastika,
when I see this swastika, the name Hitler comes to mind, who was, of course, the source of all the evil of the Nazi regime in Germany. And so it always reminds me of seeing pictures, movie pictures. After I came to the United States, I remember we used to see newsreels, and you can take it for granted there were always newsreels in this country which showed some parade or some other event in Germany where Hitler was kneeling on an open car with his left arm up, the Heil Hitler sign, which was part, by the way, of the swastika too, and yelling and screaming on the part of people who were on the sides watching the parade, and yelling Heil Hitler, and so on. Those are the thoughts that come to my mind. I think it's important for people to learn about the Holocaust because it is undoubtedly one of the worst and most horrible events in human history in terms of the numbers of people who were murdered, the manner in which they were murdered, and all the events that surround that period. And I think it's important to point out also that the swastika and the Heil Hitler and Hitler himself are only a part of it, because there was so much more to it. We have to remember that the Holocaust could not possibly have been carried out in the horrible manner in which it did if it hadn't been for the strong support of so many other European people who supported the Nazis. I would like to make a particular point that one country and the people from one country that is so much in the news today, the Ukraine, was very, very much involved in supporting the Nazis during World War II. So the Holocaust is a worldwide event of a magnitude that we don't even fully grasp today. But that is what we have to keep in mind, that the Nazis started it, and Hitler was the ringleader and all that. But there were so many others. And while that is, of course, extremely important for young people to know, there is also a good side which the Holocaust should bring up and teach our young students in school, which is that there were decent and nice human beings who went out of their way to hide Jews and others who were about to be killed and murdered by the Nazis. And there were many, many of them too. And so that also is something that the Holocaust can and should and must teach our young students today. By talking and teaching about the Holocaust, I think we are also offering the opportunity to talk about anti-Semitism in a general way and perhaps get to some of the other aspects of anti-Semitism that is on the rise again today, and to see what we might do to fight anti-Semitism and to prevent its spread in this country and elsewhere in the world. So I think the study of the Holocaust is an indirect method to also grapple with the issue of anti-Semitism, which is a part of the Holocaust, an important part clearly, but it may be also good to learn the connection between that term, anti-Semitism, and its many other forms in which it has been used and is being used and utilized today.